the first person I'm going to invite to speak, fantastic campaigner, all of my life and all of his life. Please give a very warm welcome to Tariq Ali.
Dear friends, two things need to be... Can you hear me? No. No? No. The mic's not working. Can you hear me now? Two things need to be spelled out at the very outset. The first is the question which we are often asked: what happened to the large crowds who turned out 10 years ago? And the response to that is very simple, that the enormous majority of people who came out 10 years ago to try and stop a war were people who had never demonstrated. It was their first time out, and most of them genuinely believed that if they came out in large numbers, and in terms of the global scale it was millions, they could stop the politicians from going to war. And they didn't realize, we have to say this, that it takes more than large demonstrations these days to stop the politicians from going to a war to which they've been committed and which they've been planning for a year and a half previously. I never thought we would stop Blair from going to war. More or less said so at the demonstration. But the fact that so many people came out was, on their part, a signal that they did not believe the lies that the politicians were telling the people in order to go to war. That march was a march to stop the war and a march to say to the politicians, we know your lies. And of course, people who are not active all their lives can't keep coming out week after week. If we'd had 2 million people on the streets throughout the war, there would have been a revolution. It doesn't happen like that. But the important thing to understand is that the Stop the War coalition that was built in this country, in particular, has kept on going. Despite the vicissitudes, despite the changes in mood, it was important to keep this coalition going. And many of us involved in it knew the reason that these wars were not accidental wars, that these wars were not going to stop necessarily, big wars or small wars, that they were going to go on. And in that, unfortunately, we've been vindicated. Because these wars are effectively imperial wars, backed and waged by the world's only global empire, the United States. One has to understand that fact. And it pains me when good people, especially in the United States, who are hostile to wars when Bush was waging them, become passive when Obama wages them. Because effectively what we notice in the United States today is imperial continuity. Guantanamo is still there. More drone attacks on Pakistan and Afghanistan and Yemen and Somalia under Obama than there were under Bush. The President of the United States has now the power, legal power, to order the execution of any American citizen, leave alone citizens from the rest of the world. That is the world we live in. And in this world, opposition does not come from mainstream politicians, whether of center left or center right. Jeremy and a handful of other members of parliament are an exception, unfortunately. They are not the norm. By and large, center-left and center-right parties throughout Europe have backed wars, including the German Greens, including the French Greens, not the English Greens, have backed wars. So in this situation, building a coalition of anti-war activists that span all political parties, we don't mind where people are from as long as they understand the need to oppose these wars. Secondly, in this technological age, where the power of the image has become extremely important, it had become very easy, which is a tragedy in which we have to be careful about, to build up certain images, push those images on the screen to get populations to agree to go to war. I have spoken to people, including some anti-war activists, who have said, well, if Saddam Hussein had been carrying out atrocities just before the Iraq war, maybe I would have supported that war. And people like that got carried away by Libya, supporting the so-called no-fly zone over Benghazi, and then getting trapped into supporting that whole imperial expedition, which backfired. Because in that very Benghazi, the American ambassador was killed, the Italian ambassador was fired at, there was an attempt on the British ambassador's life. So these wars, even from the point of view of imperial aims, don't necessarily work. They work economically. The Americans might have withdrawn militarily from Iraq and stationed themselves on its fringes, but Iraqi oil is today owned by the big multinational companies. In Libya, all the big multinationals are there to get hold of the oil. So we should be careful before we say they failed. They have not failed economically and politically. And they're carrying on. Mali is, the French send these so-called troops, the French regime, desperate to go into Syria, vetoed by Obama from having an outright intervention for their own reasons, desperate to intervene, finally go into Mali. A Mali destabilized by the war against Libya, where a lot of Africans who Gaddafi had employed in the army then left, were forced to leave, and came and created havoc in Mali. So one disaster leads to the other. And even as we gather here today, the Malian army is fighting each other. So these are complex situations which we have to deal with. And the point is very simple. It's not that most of us support Gaddafi, like we didn't support Saddam Hussein's regime, or what Assad is doing. That goes without saying. But what doesn't go without saying, and should in this political culture in which we're inserted, is that all attempts by imperial powers and their vassal states in Europe to try and solve the problem by occupying countries, by using drones, makes the situation worse, not better. And so we should take... And so to conclude, because my time is up, I would say that the model that we have created, and I normally am ultra-critical of this country and its politics, but I'm very proud of this movement, because a movement like this we managed to keep going, largely through the dedication of not so many people, even a small number of people, many of them here today, who've kept this movement going when it has collapsed in country after country. And I think one of our tasks has to be, for especially people here from abroad, to try and rebuild and recreate an anti-war movement globally and fight politically to convince those who have become passive or who don't want to oppose Obama that war is war, regardless of who wages it. Thank you.